Good evening. I want to add my thanks to Professor Moylan's thanks. I am so appreciative of this invitation and being here with you on your beautiful campus in your beautiful city, Antwerp. And thank you to the planning committee, and especially thank you to Sarah, who has been so attentive and hardworking in making my trip and this conference possible. Professor Moylan, thank you for your introduction and for your sustaining friendships over the many decades. Tonight, I'm going to discuss the interrelated goals for equality and voting rights embodied in the U.S. civil rights movement. This movement in the mid-20th century changed tactics to adopt mass and direct non-violent methods of resistance, tactics which were essentially utopian in that they rested on the hope that change could be accomplished non-violently. I will tell a number of stories spanning a period of 70 years about various ideals for political equality and their circulations over time and space. I use political equality as a term to include the rights to universal suffrage, to participate in elections, and the ideal that every person's vote should count equally. I conclude by describing how these circulations intersect in the discourses around contemporary voting rights in the United States, drawing on my experiences. To connect my stories, I make a case for circulation studies to examine the ways in which utopian ideals and tactics are used and shared and changed by individuals and groups in different contexts and time periods. I argue that circulation studies should be an interdisciplinary approach which allows for a dynamic understanding of Utopia's global appeal. It draws attention to the labor involved in the reinterpretation of ideals. It allows for a greater appreciation of non-Christian and non-European traditions and the ways these traditions intersect and combine. It emphasizes the complexity of the movement of ideas and allows us to discover unexpected borrowings and adaptations. Philosophical lineages are uncoupled from structures of power and no longer only travel from west to east. Finally, I argue that it can help us to understand and promote the creation of diverse coalitions. Many scholars are attempting to understand how circulation takes place and the ways it interacts with global capital and politics. Paul Gilroy's Black Atlantic emphasized the exchange of cultures over a template first traced by the transatlantic slave trade. Sharon Slowinski maps the global movement of human rights ideals by tracing the circulation of images and narratives of their abuses and that impact that the viewers have when they view the circulation on them and how they participate then in reformulating what constitutes human rights. Anand Singh, an anthropologist, describes an ethnography of globalization, focusing on the friction created by the universal and particular ideals put in the service of resistance to global capitalism. Cultural studies and historians have provided and suggested a more cosmopolitan criticism and a more worldly reading of texts, and historians trace the circulation of ideals and tactics across continents. Finally, the circulation of ideals have been explored by some political scientists, not many, but a few. Catherine Sickink describes how new international norms, especially those pertaining to human rights, have taken root and become accepted in global and regional organizations. She describes how norms emerge, how they become diffuse, how they reach a tipping point before they cascade and become accepted by the international community. Another political scientist Anne Florini, points out that the more powerful states have more resources to circulate their ideas more frequently and try to shape the international dimension and universe that way. Turning now to the United States. The struggle for equality and suffrage in the United States has a long history, as the inherited inequalities from Europe and the institutions of racial slavery and their entailments, which were developed simultaneously and alongside representative democracy, both had to be overcome. Freedom and the ability to vote can mean many things. And in the United States, voting identified a standing of freedom that was sharply contrasted with slavery. Although the right to universal franchise was gradually broadened to include black men after the US Civil War, from the beginning of the 1890s to the first decade of the 20th century, all the former slave-owning Confederate states passed legislation formalizing racial segregation and eliminating black men from the voter rolls. Black women were not allowed to vote, period. Southern states, in that effort, devised disenfranchising measures which included the poll tax and literacy tests. For example, in the state of Alabama, the state's Association of Lawyers designed a 68-question examination, which they would then ask voters who were, citizens who were applying to vote, to take the test. That test was mandatory. One wrong answer would deny the applicant the vote. So, for example, one question asked applicants the size of the District of Columbia. So in 1940, only 151,000 black Americans in the South were registered to vote. That constituted 3% of the eligible black population. In 1961, 13 counties in 4 southern states, where blacks were the majority in the population in these counties, there was not one single black person registered to vote. Black Americans fought against this political exclusion by using the law. And the biggest success of this part of the civil rights movement was in 1954 when the US Supreme Court passed its historic decision, Brown versus Board of Education, which declared segregation as inherently unequal and therefore unconstitutional. This led to a revoking of many racially discriminatory laws. However, voting in the United States is not a federal responsibility, it is a state responsibility, in that the rules on who is eligible to vote, how do you register voters, the design of the ballot itself, and the conduct of elections remains in the hands of individual states. For the first half of the 20th century, voting remained illegal for the majority of black Americans living in the South. The resistance to integration and the 1954 US Supreme Court decision led to an evolution in the civil rights movement. And the leadership switched from lawyers like Thurgood Marshall to ministers like Martin Luther King. And the tactics changed as well. The fight for equality after the impatience rose was yoked to nonviolence, civil disobedience, and mass direct action. What were the sources of these ideas for this new phase in the civil rights movement? I've identified 4 sources, but in the interest of time, I will dwell only on one. The first 3 would include the writings of Henry David Thoreau and his essay on civil disobedience, the African National Congress's Defiance Campaign in South Africa in 1951 and 52, and the Bandung Conference in Bandung, Indonesia in 1955. But the most important source of this tactic of nonviolence and using the masses on the streets to protest directly with their bodies was the brainchild of Bayard Rustin, who is the most direct link and conduit for the idea and practice to the civil rights movement. Bayard Rustin was born in 1912, and he was a Democrat democratic socialist, a pacifist, a civil rights activist, and a labor union organizer. He joined an organization called the FOR, the Fellowship of Reconciliation, in 1941. He was recruited by its head, A.J. Muste, who was the leading spokesperson for pacifism in the United States. At that time, the FOR was promoting Gandhi's ideas, and Muste was committed to total pacifism and the struggle for African American equality. Rustin believed in total nonviolence, and he wrote extensively and spoke all around the country on its principles. And he developed very unique techniques of nonviolent resistance and used them when he was confronted with racial discrimination. For example, he advocated the Y method, a technique that promoted a certain kind of behavior. And I'm going to quote from one of his colleagues, George Hauser, quote, "Here the victim of discrimination proceeds as though equality existed. Upon being told to move to a Jim Crow railroad car, a segregated car, for example, he simply asks why. Although finally he may be forced to accept the consequences of his position, such as being arrested or being moved to a segregated area, he has raised a vital issue." End of quote. Rustin used this technique at a restaurant in Indianapolis when he was refused service. He asked why, and was told that whites would not eat if they saw him being served. When he asked the proprietor if she had ever served Negroes, and she answered in the negative, he proposed that they engage in an experiment. He would sit by the door with a hamburger on his plate for 15 minutes. If any whites left the restaurant in protest, he would leave. The owner agreed, and Rustin sat for some time with an uneaten hamburger. No white customers left the restaurant, and his cold hamburger was then replaced with a hot one, and the proprietor asked him what he wanted to drink. A minor victory. So the Fellowship of Reconciliation and its offshoot, the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE, trained Rustin and his generation of protesters by conducting workshops, printing guidelines, and performing mock scenarios of the protest before it happened. These were called sociodramas, and sometimes they included training people with abusive language and body blows. Volunteers were taught discipline and were required to dress conservatively, as if they were going to church. They were instructed to be courteous, to obey instructions, and not to respond to abuse. Members had to commit to working in interracial groups and accept discipline. These steps included investigation, and I'm quoting, investigation, negotiation, demonstration, and such as a direct challenge as picketing and boycotting, etc. One of the important aims was to foster a spirit of understanding rather than antagonism. And that's a direct quote. Performing protests was a tactic developed by Rustin's generation of Gandhian and civil rights activists in the 1940s. And these tactics were innovative and pioneering. The performance was built on three assumptions: the need to appeal to the conscience of the opposition, the nonviolent nature of the conduct of the protest, and the acceptance of penalties, which included the embracing of suffering. The American reformulations of nonviolent tactics lay in the language used, the tactics developed, and the use of Christianity. In 1955, when Bayard Rustin was sent to Montgomery, Alabama to advise Martin Luther King, Rustin was not only older than Martin Luther King, but far more experienced in nonviolent direct action tactics. He had participated and organized in the preceding decade attempts to desegregate restaurants, swimming pools, barbershops, buses, libraries, with a variety of protests that included sit-ins, wait-ins, read-ins in the library. They would go and read on this floor in libraries that were segregated, bury-ins in segregated cemeteries, and swim-ins. The Montgomery Bus boycott of 1955 was a movement in which 50,000 blacks boycotted the public schools, the public system of bus transportation for over a year. It had been initiated with the arrest of Rosa Parks, a respected member of the community. Initially, Martin Luther King was unsure of these tactical recommendations he received from CORE and the Fellowship of Reconciliation. King believed in the right to self-defense, and he had a permit to carry a gun. And he kept a gun in the glove compartment of his car, and he had guns in his house, and the black community had rallied around. There was a bombing of his house in Montgomery, and so they were defending King's house with guns. So there's a whole tradition of armed self-defense that existed in black southern communities, which used guns for protection from white vigilante terrorist groups and from state and local police forces. But the use of guns, even for self-defense, alarmed Rustin, and he convinced King to relinquish his arms as he feared it would encourage others to use it and hope that the violence would escalate and go out of control in Montgomery. And King followed the advice. And his appreciation of nonviolence deepened with the boycott's successes, and he, Martin Luther King, became convinced that it was the best method to confront injustice. The FOR's creative tactics of direct mass action and nonviolence included the publication of a comic book, which I'm going to be circulating right now. It's a copy. But they published this comic book called Martin Luther King and the Montgomery Story, How 50,000 Negroes Found a New Way to End Racial Discrimination. They sold it for 10 cents. And the idea was to spread the message of nonviolence and the Fellowship of Reconciliation's mission in a way that was very visually easy to digest. The comic book's final 6 pages are devoted to what is called the Montgomery method. And these principles include highlighting the importance of individuals to create social change, to the necessity of loving one's enemy, and to separating the sin from the sinner. The Montgomery method became a model for other movements to follow. And the comic book was to circulate and inspire 50 years after it was published, when a young Egyptian human rights activist, Dalia Ziada, encountered the comic book in 2006. She read the comic book, she found the principles of nonviolent resistance inspirational and applicable to her situation. So she translated the comic book into Arabic. At the time, she was working for an organization called the American Islamic Congress. And in 2008, the organization published the Arabic version of the comic book and distributed thousands of copies of the comic book in the Middle East, including in Tahrir Square, where it was used by protesters in 2011. Zaida distributed copies personally in Tahrir in order, she said, quote, to remind people of the techniques and to remind them that there were people who did it before us and we can do it too, end of quote. She wanted to be, she said, the Martin Luther King of Egypt, she told the journalist. And she promoted civil disobedience in Egypt and the Middle East by a variety of mechanisms. Different interpretations exist on assessing the impact of the comic book on activists on Tahrir Square, which was a national and peaceful sit-in. But activists around the world have used Tahrir itself as a model, including Occupy Wall Street movement in the United States, whose members were in communication with Egyptian activists. And from Occupy, the movement also was then spread to at least Madrid and Kazakhstan. I understand there was a workers' movement that was inspired by Occupy. So you can draw a number of different circulations after Tahrir. So Martin Luther King lived to see the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. And this act in 1965 provided the federal government of the United States the power to oversee and protect voting rights in the South. And the effect of the federal oversight was felt almost immediately. Because in 1964, only 6.7% of African Americans were registered to vote. And in 4 years, the percentage rose to almost 60%. In 1993, 71% of Black Americans were registered to vote. And also real gains were made with the election of thousands of African Americans to public office at the local, state, and federal levels. In 1965, Black elected officials numbered approximately 1,400. In 2009, they numbered 10,000. Both political parties, by the way, received benefits from the passage of the Voting Rights Act. The Democrats gained the loyalty of African Americans, and the Republican Party gained the affections of white, Southern, disaffected voters who switched their allegiance from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party, and voting has been polarized, in the South ever since. I now turn to the contemporary circulations of ideals having to do with political equality. The defining principle of the right to participate in elections, whose outcomes should represent the wishes of its citizens, was asserted in Article 21, Number 3, in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights adopted by the United Nations in 1948. And this article reads, quote, "The will of the people shall be the basis of the authority of government. This will shall be expressed in periodic and genuine elections, which shall be by universal and equal suffrage, and shall be held by secret vote or by equivalent free voting procedures." There is no utopian literature on elections and voting. I asked Lyman Sargent, and he was able to locate one short story by Isaac Asimov called Franchise. But if you know of any sources, please let me know. The UN Declaration of Human Rights provided a connection between human rights and voting rights. These ideas have become ubiquitous and a part of the democratic creed. It includes an equality between votes, summarized in the phrase, "one person, one vote." As these principles remain unrealized, they are hopeful utopian horizons for many communities around the world. I will describe an international emerging consensus on democratic elections and voting, and then we'll move to the current situation in the US, where there is a divide on voting in which two sides draw upon this international language of human rights to pursue very different ends. Elections were once deemed a part of national sovereignty. Today, they are observed routinely by outside observers from regional and international and non-state actors. Election observation is now an expression of the international community's consensus regarding the desirability of elections to represent the will of the majority. Nation-states were originally reluctant to become involved in observing other nation-states' elections, but then with the end of the Cold War and the emergence of what some people call transitional democracies, this ushered a new era in international election observation. It is estimated that between 1960 and 2006, about 1,800 elections were held in about 141 countries, and 80% of those have been observed. If you are a member state of the OSCE, you have to ask the OSCE to observe your elections when you hold them. It is part of your membership. So you sign that. You sign the dotted line. There's an increasing professionalization of election observers. A number of manuals and white papers have been published. These efforts to codify international standards are important as they define what democratic standards for elections should include and what constitutes acceptable election laws and voting practices. And notwithstanding the emerging consensus on how to observe elections, the definition of what constitutes free and fair remains unresolved, and no universal standard exists for what is a free and fair election. Now, in the United States, the connections between democracy and voting remain elusive and are reflected in the recurring contestation in and around popular voting. The structure of elections and voting methods have become extraordinarily politicized. There is a heightened awareness of how every aspect of an election can help to determine its outcome. beginning with the registration of voters and early voting, the location of polling centers, the timing of elections, the election laws themselves, the composition of national and electoral commissions, to election day voting procedures, and then the tabulation of results at the local and national level, and then the adjudication if there is any dispute about the results. Voter inequality in the United States is made possible by state and local control over the election system. In the United States, there is a vast patchwork of rules and regulations designed by local and state authorities for over 3,000 counties with 180,000 precincts and 114,000 polling stations. The contestation about voting and election procedures is so pronounced that the struggles have been dubbed voting wars. The worst of the voting restrictions continues to be in southern states and continues to target racialized populations. For the past 15 years, conservative political parties and organizations have understood that they will be unable to win national elections by popular vote, a realization that was made clear in the wake of the 2000 Florida election, the presidential election, where the margin of victory was a total of 537 votes in Florida. Florida demonstrated the significance of counting votes and voter turnout. This very narrow win was achieved after Florida had purged thousands of Floridians from its voter rolls using a private company based in Texas to compile lists of ex-felons. Florida bars former felons from voting. This represents approximately 7.5% of Florida's population, or about 827,000 individuals. Other tactics used in Florida included rejecting cast ballots, whereby black voters were 10 times more likely to have their ballots discounted. Also, Florida's voting machines were antiquated and were often inaccurate. And nationally, it was estimated that between 4 and 6 million votes were lost in the 2000 election. The tactics promoted by conservatives can be categorized as tactics of voter suppression, as evidenced in the felony disenfranchisement laws, and voter intimidation. That includes creating a chilly environment in the polling station, challenging voters' identities, and having voters wait in long lines, sometimes up to 6 hours, to vote. In addition, some conservative groups challenge state laws by mounting well-funded legal cases. All these efforts are designed to limit certain categories of citizens from voting, especially citizens from minority groups, the young, the elderly, and the poor, who tend to vote for the more progressive political party. Ex-felon disenfranchisement is of particular importance since the United States has over 1 million men and women in the prison system today, a population that has quadrupled from 1980 to 2000. In 2000, it is estimated that 6 million Americans were barred from voting. And today it is estimated that 8.5 million citizens are denied the vote because of their felony convictions. This has provided a political opportunity for Democrats whose goals now align with increasing voter turnout. There are no national standards on this issue. In May this month, Virginia's Democratic governor signed a bill allowing 200,000 felons, convicted felons, who had served their time in prison, served their probation and parole. He allowed them to vote. He gave them the right to register and to vote. The governor described ex-felon disenfranchisement in Virginia as a lineal descendant of the poll tax and a racist measure to disallow Black Americans the right to the franchise. Virginia is one of 4 states that have the most draconian laws regarding felons. Felons in these 4 states were barred from voting for life. So this governor's action was an executive decision made necessary in order to circumvent the Republican-controlled state legislature in Virginia, which is crying foul and saying it's not going to accept this. In March of 2016, the state legislature in Maryland allowed felons who finished their jail sentence but are serving parole or probation in Maryland, is allowing them to register to vote. The Republican governor of Maryland tried to veto this legislation and was overridden by Maryland's democratically controlled legislature. So disallowing populations like former felons from voting makes it easier for conservatives to win elections. Other parts of the conservative push against voting rights for all is the call for voter identification laws, voter ID laws. States are passing laws mandating that voters have to provide government-issued ID cards. Today, 19 states have passed such laws, making it more difficult to vote. These laws are confusing because each state decides for itself what constitutes identification that is proper and what is not. Now, interestingly, 7 out of the 11 states that have the highest turnout of Black Americans were states that made it more difficult for Blacks to vote. And the same thing happened with Hispanic populations in certain states. Those that had large turnout of Hispanic voters passed voter identification laws. 6 states passed voter identification laws, sometimes requiring a photo ID, which was costly to obtain for those with little means and the elderly who often do not have cars or driver licenses, or in some instances they don't have birth certificates. Women who change their names because their status changed are impacted by this. And they have to do the extra work to get a voter ID card of some sort. Youth are also targeted in voter ID laws. Some states require photos while others do not. Wisconsin was one of the first states to pass a voter ID, photo ID law. So you have voter ID, photo ID, where students had to provide a student ID card that had a signature and an expiration date. And in 2011, student ID cards in Wisconsin were not dated and did not have a signature. Early voting has become contentious when it became popular and widely used. In 2006, 1 out of every 5 voters voted before Election Day. In 2008, the numbers rose to 1 out of every 3 voters. They vote before Election Day. It's easier. As Election Day in America falls on a working day, it falls on a Tuesday, not a weekend. Early voting is popular with voting people who find it easier to vote around their work schedules. Florida has cut back on its early voting days from 14 to 8, specifically targeting the Sunday before election because that's the day that Black churches in Florida had been very successful in taking congregations to vote and a get out the vote effort. Very successful, so they cut that day out. In one clear case of meanness, in the effort to discourage voters to go to the polls, the Miami-Dade County Elections Department in Florida is implementing a policy of closing bathrooms in all polling stations when voters have often had to stand for 6 hours in order to vote. So there are no toilets, okay, in that particular county. A lawyer for the disabled had inquired about the bathroom facilities for the disabled for his clients and was startled when the Miami-Dade County Elections Department responded by saying it would have to close all bathroom facilities in order not to discriminate against the disabled because their bathrooms were not disabled user-friendly. It was not noticed that the conservative assaults on voting equality constitute a pattern until 2011, when the Brennan Center for Justice, a nonpartisan think tank, responded to distress calls from around the country regarding these new voting requirements. The center found that almost 5 million voters were going to find it very difficult to cast their vote. And actually this movement on the part of conservatives is really a movement for voter repression. Now, this movement for voter repression is using the circulating language of human rights and elections to couch their arguments. Terms such as voter fraud, voter equality, election integrity are important in the conservative arguments. Voter fraud is a term used to describe a person impersonating a voter. It is a very rare occurrence. Yet many Republicans believe that voter fraud is endemic and causing their party to lose elections. Poll watching is a tactic some groups are using when election observation is put in the service of voter intimidation. One such group's membership is composed of Tea Party members, headquartered in Texas, and led by Catherine Engelbrecht, who is a founder of an organization called True the Vote, and King Street Patriots. These activists are well-funded and increasingly well-connected with many state election officials and members of Congress. They call for election integrity. These groups mobilize support for stringent voter ID laws and other issues, some of which have been adopted by the Republican Party. This group, for example, will comb through voter registration lists, state databases, driver license databases, and jury lists to find any inconsistency, perhaps a difference in the middle initial, or a slight difference in handwriting, or if there are too many names coming from one address, that's an immigrant family. You see, let's begin to check on their citizenship papers, is what they do. So when they find inconsistencies, they take these inconsistencies to state officials for investigation and removal if found to be ineligible. Although the results of their research have found to be without much merit at all, it ties up the time and the effort of state election officials to have to go through these this kind of research. On the other side of the voting wars are groups who call for, the good guys, who call for voting integrity or election integrity, such as the National Election Integrity Coalition, and there have been some very heartening episodes of voter education that has been very grassroots in its efforts. So elections in the United States are observed by domestic observers and by the OSCE, international observers. As a member of the OSCE, the United States has to request that the OSCE observe its elections. It didn't used to until Russia raised the issue, why isn't the United States elections being observed? So then the OSCE sort of has to come over and observe. And they have monitored US elections for over 10 years, and they put the results on their website. So in 2012, the OSCE sent a limited, small delegation, and they found some interesting things. Okay, so the OSCE's preliminary report on the 2012 general election generally was very laudatory, especially with regard to the election's pluralistic environment. But the OSCE had many points of concern. Too many decisions were too unduly politicized, they said. There was too much decentralization of election laws. The implementation was too decentralized. There were too many last-minute amendments to election laws, which led to confusion. A lack of transparency in funding. Other points of concern included the large number of eligible voters who were not registered. The felony disenfranchisement of 5.9 million citizens was noted. The variation on the rules regarding voter identification, the partisan nature of cable TV, and the lack of state laws to allow for international observers. It is ironic that in 2012, OSCE sent some monitors to a polling station, and the chief judge disallowed them entry into the polling station, which goes totally against what the OSCE has in its rules. Voting rights activists in the United States may take comfort in OSCE's reports where it describes and affirms what we already know. It is useful to be able to reference international standards, to compare and contrast, to see how certain practices are contrary to accepted international standards. Yet it is doubtful as to whether the electoral system in the US is sensitive to world public opinion, and the OSCE's reports are not widely circulated. The circulation here is stymied in part because of the ideology of American exceptionalism. As the international community continues to standardize ways to conduct and assess elections and point to new areas of concern, such as barriers to youth voting is a very big topic, and gender violence at the polls, the United States will continue to be assessed by these standards, and an engrossing dialectic might take place between local, national, and international circulating standards and norms for free and fair elections. The right to the franchise and to participate in politics has been a struggle for Black Americans for 150 years. The right was won, it was taken away, it was reinstated after a great human rights struggle in the mid-20th century. In that struggle, activists used a variety of tactics, some taken from local traditions, others from Africa and Asia, and reinterpreted to suit their needs. They referenced international understandings of human rights and devised creative tactics. Today, these same rights are under attack. Those who aim to constrict voting rights use the same language of voting and human rights to couch their arguments, but this cannot obscure the fact that the aims of such groups are in alignment with voter suppression, low voter turnout, and voter intimidation. My talk has focused on the utopian ideal of political participation through voting and the tactic of nonviolence. Both seek to establish processes to bring about needed social change. One lesson that can be drawn is the deep connection that exists between ideals and tactics. Both are to acknowledge Ruth Levitas's contribution. Methods, ideals and tactics, both are methods that can lead to change. They circulate and are transformed. They provide horizons of hope. They do not provide a specific goal, only ways to proceed. And as Tom Moylan has proposed, it is best to use the word utopian as a modifier. To do so is to allow for that part of human nature, the political, that is so essential for us to live together and to decide on how we are going to live together, to be expressed. Thomas More's narrative of a society radically better than the one he occupied continues to inform our understanding for the need to ground our hopes in imagination and criticism. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this interesting lecture. We have time for some questions. Thank you.
Well, I was pleasantly surprised that you connected voting and representative democracy with a utopian dimension, because that seems to be a little bit, I would not say out of date, but certainly not very, many people would disagree with you. There, on the one hand, is the long tradition of theorists who explain that representative democracy, elections, are in a sense instituting some sort of inequality. You know, representative democracy has been called an elective aristocracy. And we have these theorists who explain that it's precisely the representative nature of representative democracy which creates this inequality. Because who is elected? Somebody who stands out. So that's one remark that struck me, and so I would like to hear how you would respond to this. And picking up a more, let's say, recent development, also I think all over the world, is the rise of the deliberative democracy, which started out, I think, as perhaps some people tried to supplant representative democracy through deliberative democracy, but at least they try to supplement it, in a sense. So, and one of the reasons is precisely the idea that deliberative democracy ensures the people, let's say, or at least some citizens, a better say and more influence on what's happening in their country. So these are two criticisms, two objections against precisely the equality and the popular dimension of representative democracy and voting in elections. And so I'm not saying that I agree with them, but I would like to hear your responses to these two objections or criticisms of elections and representative democracy.
Yeah, thank you for your question. Let me deal with the first question first. There are limitations to what voting can do, and sort of I'm well aware of them. I mean, we're not even talking about economic democracy. I mean, how can you have real change if you're just going to limit it to political rights if you have vast inequalities in a society, political equality in voting is not going to solve some of the major issues in that kind of a society. But in a way, I understand that, but sometimes you don't pick your battles, the battles pick you. It's where you find yourself. And today, that's where we find ourselves. Now, we can say elections are not important. Let's not waste our time fighting for fighting against the voter identification laws. But then, what will happen is that you're going to have even more unrepresentative governments and draconian public policies that are going to hurt those who are most vulnerable in society. So it's where you find yourself, and at this point in time, in the United States, we have to fight this particular battle again and again and again. I mean, this has been a very long, since the beginning of the American Republic, we have always had contention around who can vote. It has never been a universal right that has been open to everybody. At first, white men without property had to get the vote. They fought for the vote. Then it was black men. Then it was women. Then it was black people in general. Now, so it's and the young. Gradually it's been broadened, but it's something that I think every generation has to fight. It's not something like, we're done, we can move on to other kinds of problems. This kind of problem, because of slavery, because of the way in which the system is structured, keeps on coming up again and again. And if you don't think it's important, then why are the conservatives? Look at how the conservatives are trying to overturn the Voting Rights Act. They've been successful in weakening it, we had a stolen election in Florida in 2000. It was a stolen election. And history might have been very different had it not been stolen. So, I take your point, but it is what it is at this point. I find myself having to address this kind of issue. Now, I'm not quite sure about the second question, if you could repeat the question.
So it's about deliberative democracy as an alternative to representative democracy. And
Deliberative democracy?
Deliberative democracy.
Oh.
Yes, and so the idea that we could perhaps, or that the people's voice, or the citizens' voice can be better expressed through deliberative councils or deliberative settings. And for instance, we had in Belgium, it's all over, we had somebody, when the representative process was breaking down, who tried to organize a citizens' meeting which would help the country to come out of a crisis. And so that's the claim. I'm not supporting. I just would like to hear your reply to that.
As a black American, okay, I am very suspicious of local control over politics, because the experience of black Americans in the South has been that when you have local control, that's when things go really wrong for black Americans. We have had to, for our own particular experience, reach out to the federal government and get federal protection over local forces. So when we start talking about deliberative democracy, you are talking about local control. And when you talk about local control, you have, in some communities, extremely right-wing groups, evangelical Christians, fundamentalists of every stripe, some misogynists and racists. They begin to become very active. They are very active. So I don't think at this point I would be touting deliberative democracy unless things were very different in the United States. At this point, I don't think that's a solution, because it's at the state and local level where the problems really exist. In the South, especially, but not exclusively.
Okay. Thank you very much. Some more questions? Yes, please.
Thank you very much for your lecture. You mentioned briefly the ANC in your talk, and of course one of the contrasts that comes to mind between the ANC's also ultimately successful campaign for franchise extension, which is what among other things it was about, with the civil rights movement, is that it did use violence. So I just would be interested to know what you think about that, really. So obviously they were looking also to models, partly westernized models of post-colonial appropriation of political control. It's obvious why they might have been pushed in that direction given the circumstances in which they were operating during the war period up to black majority rule in 1994. But I have some colleagues who think that utopianism has to extend to utopianism of means. That is quite a popular liberal position. So, on this view, it's not simply that ideals apply to the end state that you're trying to realize politically, but to the means that you avail yourself of in order to reach them. So the political means themselves are a kind of microcosm of what you would like ultimately to achieve, and you don't, according to this view, want an opposition between a kind of utilitarianism of means and an idealism of ends, as it were. So I just would be interested to know what you thought about that.
So in my presentation, I was referencing the Defiance Campaign of 1951-52, and that was when the ANC was very much under the spell, if you will, of Gandhi's ideas of nonviolence. And after a while, it became very clear, of course, that there were real limits to how much nonviolence could achieve. And so you had splits in the ANC, and then they took up some sort of a principled way of waging the liberation struggle. But for Black Americans, the Defiance Campaign was something that allowed them to see that there were parallels between the experiences of African Americans and those of Black Africans in South Africa. And so it was those parallels that opened up their sense that there were other communities around the world. So it opened and enlarged sort of a sense of solidarity. So I'm only referencing the Defiance Campaign and that impact, and the impact it had on the Black intelligentsia at that time. Interestingly enough, it was Nelson Mandela who came up with the one person, one vote term, and he influenced John Lewis, who was a young civil rights activist in America, who used the term in 1963 for the first time, one person, one vote, which now has become sort of a standard, ubiquitous way to talk about. And you can understand why Nelson Mandela would argue for one person, one vote when Black South Africans were in the majority, so it made, but it was sort of, so that was another circulation that I sort of came up sort of by accident, this one person, one vote connection. So, means and ends. Okay, means and ends. That's what I'm arguing here, is that the means and the ends dovetail very closely, and that you cannot separate the two, right? And that the tactic of nonviolence is itself a utopian hope that you can achieve change without resorting to violence. there are some situations, you know, like Gandhi found that nonviolence was not possible to be successful in South Africa, so he sort of took his ideas to India where it worked, you know, better, you know. But yes, I do think that's an interesting dialectic that we can explore later. Yeah. But I don't have anything, you know, sort of definitive to say beyond that. For this presentation, I thought the two really worked well together.
Sure.
Yeah, as both goal and method, you know. Yeah.
Thank you.
Some more questions?
Yes, great.
Just a comment, really, on Lyman's comment to you
Yes.
about the presence or lack thereof of discussions of the franchise within the tradition of utopian literature. There is, in fact, a very rich tradition of talking about the exercise of the franchise, normally not extending as far as universal suffrage in the 17th and 18th century, mostly because the vast majority of liberal, even radical liberal writers, in the sense in which we'd use the term today, thought that servants or dependents didn't merit the franchise, usually including, of course, not just servants, but also wives and children in that. Tradition is mostly associated with James Harrington, Commonwealth of Oceania, of 1656, the so-called Neo-Harringtonians, who produced works like The Free State of No Land, I don't know if you know this, 1696, as I recall, right through the early years of the French Revolution, still in the modern political thought tradition understood as disciples of Harrington. Works like The Commonwealth of Reason, William Hodgson, 1795. That tradition, generally speaking, melting into a number of other forms of what are now not usually associated with Harringtonian republicanism, right through the 1820s and the 1830s. So almost any radical democratic utopian depiction of the future has a discussion of how the franchise is to be wielded. And of course, from the early 1790s onwards, it gets more and more universal. Hodgson first, was amongst the first to propose that women get the franchise as well. So there is, I think, quite an important intersection here. It doesn't have a direct bearing on what you're talking about. But it's a very interesting tradition. Anyway.
Okay, thank you for that. Thank you. I have to tell Lyman.
Last question, perhaps?
Well, just a comment to pick up on your question or comment, and taking the nonviolent movement as the example. And if I could make a distinction between the utopian as an abstract, absolute, a fixed position, and the utopian as a horizon or a goal toward which one moves. And in the U.S. nonviolent movement, shortly after the period Hoda's talking about, there was a strong debate, in fact a split, between the pacifists, who took an absolute position that no violence of any kind must ever be tolerated. And then within the often younger, but not only younger, nonviolent activists, a much more different position. Rustin admitted saying, or Rustin would say that, you know, if nonviolence doesn't work, then maybe it might be necessary to resort to violence. And a whole question, too, on the nature of nonviolent action. There was a good deal of sabotage against property. There was in South Africa, and there also was in the U.S. So is this nonviolent or not? These were hotly debated, but it was always with the horizon of a nonviolent practice. But if other means were necessary, to get back to Malcolm X, you know, that might be necessary.
Sure.
So, but we can talk more. Yeah.
So, thank you very much, Professor Zaki, for this very interesting presentation.